I truly believe one of the issues in blockchain is that there's too many tokens. From my perspective, it's kind of like a web of shared security rather than an individual product winning out. Most of the innovation is going to happen on the execution layer, on the rollups. So Dimension Hub has to be just like create enough to allow the flourishment of innovation in terms of like infrastructure, in terms of application logic. There's a lot of experimentation, I believe, that will be done on Dimension. So there's a lot of cool constructions, but at the core of it is that we're product oriented and we want the best product for a developer.
Welcome to the Bare Metal Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Bare Metal Podcast. This is Martin from RockawayX. Before we get into it, I'd like to make a quick announcement. We're organizing a conference in the beautiful city of Prague. It's called Gateway to Cosmos. Some of you might have been last year. Don't miss it this year. It's going to be just as great. And with this out of the way, I'd like to welcome Barry to the podcast. Barry from Dymension. Hello.
Hey, nice to meet you and pleasure to be on.
Let's get right into the thick of it. So Dymension, I find, is a really exciting project. It's getting a lot of exposure on Twitter. And it's fairly innovative in terms of tech, in the sense that I don't think there's anything like that now. Can you explain what Dymension is? What are the participants? How do you see the system being used?
Yes, thank you. Dimension, in my opinion, is a network of chains. You can say that it's similar to Cosmos, or you can say it's kind of like a modularized Ethereum where you have execution shards and data shards and the settlement layer in between. So Dimension Hub in the beginning is the settlement layer for the ecosystem. Dimension Hub is an app chain. It's a Cosmos blockchain that runs on Tendermint, or soon to be Comet BFT most likely. And it has application-specific logic that is dedicated to, and its core mission is to service the other blockchains within the ecosystem. And those other blockchains are called rollups. Application-specific rollups, or rollups for short, and they're a Cosmos blockchain just without a BFT consensus full validator set. So on the Tendermint, you have a Cosmos blockchain that has 50, 100, 150. It doesn't truly matter a lot, but you have a distributed validator set where they reach consensus on each block produced. For rollups, they have the same or very similar business logic. So you have the staking modules, you have the banking modules, you have all the attributes from a Cosmos SDK, but you remove Tendermint for a daemon. And a daemon is an execution client that produces blocks in batches, and it publishes data to a blockchain, and it publishes state roots and the data reference to the Dimension Hub app chain. So what you get here is the execution shards of rollups and the DA shards of different Cosmos blockchains. In the middle, you have this Dimension Hub, which acts pretty much like a bridging hub, because if you want to bridge out with IBC, you run a light client of the Dimension Hub. It checks the validator set, or the honest majority of the Dimension Hub, and says, hey, like the dispute period, for example, was completed. Like there's no invalid state transitions. You're good to go. You could bridge out. So by running the Dimension Hub in the middle, and you understand the state of where the other blockchains are. So one of the issues that Cosmos Hub had when it was created and when they created Cosmos is that Cosmos Hub didn't really formalize as a hub for the ecosystem. And that's because IBC could have went from chain to chain. Like it didn't have to be routed through the Cosmos Hub. But for Dimension, the state automatically is going through the Dimension Hub. So all of the information already processes through the Dimension Hub as like the federal Supreme Court of the ecosystem. Now, the question is, what does this enable? Because this is like a lot of jargon for pretty much a complex product that you can imagine. The the rollups, which are very similar again to the Cosmos blockchains, they are VM agnostic. So you could put a WASM, you could put an Ethermint or an EVM, or you could put just like native Go modules or anything really ABCI compatible, which is the interface that communicates between the application logic and the execution client. But you don't need a distributed validator set because you're inheriting the security or the decentralization from the base layer, from the Dymension hub. So, for example, if a sequencer is performing some invalid state transitions or they're trying to kind of do something weird to their clients, then the Dymension hub would say, hey, this sequencer cannot post state updates anymore. They get slashed. We are switching it to this address. Or in a permissionless setting, that would be done automatically, and they would just get someone would submit a proof to the Dymension hub, and that would then decide if the sequencer can continue being the sequencer or not. So, in essence, you get very easily deployable Cosmos blockchains, and at the same time, because you're reducing the amount of consensus overhead, you get very low latency. So it's configurable instead of like based on the block when the block is voted and then confirmed. It's configurable. So right now we have on the testnet, we launched the testnet last month, and the first rollup was running on 0.2 second block time, and this could be reduced depending on the machine. We're running like a pretty standard server. And next, we'll have an EVM rollup, which is going to be deployed within the coming time. And that's also going to be very low latency. And along with that, we are deploying a web application, a Uniswap fork, just to demonstrate the user experience of what happens when you reduce the latency to 0.2 seconds, zero point 0.1, whatever you decide. And then we'll deploy a few more rollups just to demonstrate like what can be deployed. And then we'll include an incentivized testnet so people could deploy their own rollups and start like the community really buzzing about the potential ease of deployment and flexibility. And there's so much intricacies with the flexibility because you have different economic models that you could run now when you don't have to kind of mint rewards to secure the system. Because for example, for Ethereum, for Cosmos blockchains, for anything that are bootstrapping, is that the transaction fees aren't really high enough to compensate for the validators to continue their work. So there's a lot of mint rewards to incentivize the production. But for rollups, they're already inheriting this decentralization from the base layer. So their economics is that you just have to charge users more than what the base layer is charging you. So you can run like USDC or USDT as the gas fee instead of your own native token. And this also plays into the kind of like possible regulatory risks that people see when they deploy their own tokens, like as securities. So maybe this changes a lot of things as well in terms of like what's possible or the amount of applications that may actually end up using blockchain services.
Right. So you mentioned you guys are building several demo rollups. I think this is a good place to look at this again because this was, I mean, you've sort of explained the architecture and it was a lot of information for me to take in. Can we look at this again from a new perspective? Like, let's say I want to start my own blockchain project, right? And I'm running this calculus in my head. I've got all these options, but for now, for illustrative purposes, let's think about two options. Option number one, I'm building a sovereign chain, right? So my software stack is, as you've said, it's built off my app logic, which just plugs in as Cosmos modules or something. I use the Cosmos SDK. Plus, I build this on Tendermint. I have to go out, talk to validators, have to build a validator set. I have to somehow figure out the economics, how I'm going to reward these guys. So I have to, write something to configure the minting module. I have to have my own staking token. And when all that happens, I have to build a testnet, right? When I have my software together, I have to sort of get these validators say, hey, let's run a testnet together, we'll test the software. When testnet is, I do a couple of iterations, I'm happy with this, then I can think about going to mainnet. Now, this process takes a long time, right? It can take half a year, it can take a year, depending on the complexity of the app chain logic. So the software stack for this is pretty clear. Standard today, composed of these, Cosmos SDK, Tendermint combo, plus the IBC stack as an adjacent sidecar to talk to other chains. But then I have to do all this operational stuff, and I have to think about all these things that you said are not really necessary. So I have to do this, or I have to go and start a Dymension. Now, if I'm evaluating Dymension, I go into the docs and I start learning about what I need to do. Can you take me through that?
For a validator or for a rollup deployer?
For a blockchain project,
Yeah.
I want to run my own blockchain, and I'm deciding, do I want to build this as a roll app?
Yeah.
And let's say I have done my research and I sort of understand where I am with building a sovereign app chain, I understand the risks, the difficulties, and what's going to take time. Then my alternative is I'm going to build a roll app. So what's my experience going to be starting from writing the software, right? So first I have to write something. So you guys have, how do you replace the stack? How do I start? Is there a dev kit you guys have? And then how do I bring this thing online? Now, how long is it going to take me to launch this thing once I've written the software? How do I test this? Do we have a test net? How do I do this whole thing?
Yeah.
Can you take me through that
Of
if
course.
I'm writing my own chain?
Yeah, definitely. So the Dymension RDK is the dev kit for building your own roll app. The Dymension RDK was forked from the Cosmos SDK, so that's why you inherit the
RDK? What's the R for?
the roll
the R?
the roll app development kit.
A roll up. Yeah, could have thought of that. Sorry. Okay. Good.
So
Let's continue.
you inherit the staking modules. So actually, that's actually the one that you don't inherit. You inherit the banking modules, the minting modules, stuff like that. So all of the developers from the Cosmos ecosystem, they already understand that there's kind of like interfaces that you already have baked into the app logic. So it saves you time in terms of that. The SDK, the RDK for rollups, is we changed the staking module. So for people who are familiar with the Cosmos, it's tied with the updating validators and changing the validators in Tendermint. That doesn't happen in the RDK for rollups, so you don't have to worry about the validator set. The minting module and everything stays the same, but there's a flexibility inherent into building rollups. So in my eyes is that developers, they shouldn't also be necessarily economists. So you can deploy your own token, you can deploy your own minting methodology and your own inflation, depending on how you see the value accrual adjusting and like its pros and cons of high inflation versus low inflation. But at a base layer, it's quite simpler than building a sovereign chain. So from an economics perspective, you can accept a foreign denomination like in USDC, for example, as the gas fee. So you can remove the minting, but that's there. That's inherited into the RDK, but you can easily just not use it. So now you're charging users X USDC for using the rollup. Now you have to also you're actually posting the data on chain and the state roots on chain. So you're going to use the Diamond-like client, which is very similar to Tendermint in its kind of use case. So it runs the check TX, it runs that the transactions are valid, it batches the blocks together, and it publishes the data. So you run a like client of, for example, like Celestia as the DA layer and Dymension Hub, and then you have this autonomous machine. For a developer, they're gonna run a sequencer, like run a full node that just executes all this logic together. So instead of gathering all the validators together in one Discord or whatever, you can run it yourself as a team, or you can ask other people to be like sequencers as a service. Now, instead of getting 100 sequencers or 50 sequencers, you can just run it on one pretty much in the beginning before we introduce kind of permissionless and permissioned. So in the beginning, we're saying, hey, like the tech isn't fully there for decentralizing the sequencer. So each rollup will be permissioned to a list of sequencers. So you as a team, you can run the server yourself on AWS or whichever service that you prefer, and you host the blockchain application logic there. And then it just publishes the data to Celestia on-chain and publishes state routes to the Dymension hub. For testing, so like once you have, so in this case, you start at 0. You say, hey, I don't want minting, I don't want to deal with that, or maybe I do. This is the modules in the RDK. So you would go to the docs, and also you could go to the Cosmos SDK docs because it uses the same tooling. It's the same application logic. It's just removing the staking module and implementing something else on top of that, and which I'll discuss a little bit later. The next step would be to deploy your server. So you would go to testnet, for example. We're running a 35C testnet, which has the Dymension hub as an app chain, which a few validators are on. And then you would just submit a transaction, and this would be in the next testnet because the current testnet is permissioned to the Dymension team as a rollup deployer. So on the Dymension hub, there's a parameter that says like this address and this address can deploy rollups. That means that no one else could actually create a rollup and then submit state updates. And if you can't submit state updates to the Dymension hub, it's like it doesn't exist in the ecosystem. For the next testnet is that the someone like yourself or a developer can go to the Dymension hub, submit a transaction that says create a rollup. It gives it a namespace in the ecosystem where that public key can write state updates to the Dymension hub, and then it's like it exists in the ecosystem. People are aware, like clients are aware. Everyone understands that this can bridge in and bridge out and is a part of like this whole ecosystem of what is Dymension. So you would write the create rollup transaction on the Dymension hub, and then you can formalize whatever business logic you want on the rollup. So you can say, hey, I want to create a custom module of incentives or whatever. Or I want to use a virtual machine. So maybe I'm not comfortable going through the Go route because it's maybe more complicated, or there's a lot more involved at least. So you could bind, or what we do is that a part of the rollup development kit, there's just a make flag where you could say EVM or WASM. So it's out of the box that you already have WASM or EVM.
Right, support it.
Yeah. So for example, you want to use WASM because WASM is very popular in the ecosystem. So you would actually just build your logic in CosmWasm, and then you would deploy it on, you would just deploy the, you just run the server. Once you have the rollup transaction on the Dymension hub, you would have an individual blockchain. So now it's posting state updates. So once you're running the server on with the Diamond execution client, it's going to start posting state updates and data to the chain. The next thing that you would have to do, and this is something that we're going to speak to a lot of people and how to integrate this in the best user experience, is that you're most likely going to want an IBC connection. So since each rollup is its own individual chain, then you're going to want to start a connection between your rollup and the Dymension hub so you could connect to the whole ecosystem with one relayer. With this, that means that you would have to either be the relayer yourself in like the sequencer step, or you would actually ask someone to run the relayer as a service as well. So there's two kind of software elements or operations elements in deploying a rollup. The first one is running a sequencer, which again can be outsourced to sequencers as a service. and I'll get into why would a team want to be a sequencer or not want to be a sequencer, and also relays as a service. So because the rollups and Dimension Hub, they're like individual blockchains pretty much, that you need this IBC connection for trust minimized bridging. Now you can do it since it is a blockchain. Once it posts the state updates and data on chain, you can do another like off chain bridge, for example, like a Connext or a Hopper, one of these protocols. But being like true to the Cosmos ecosystem and being true to like what Dimension is, we want people to have IBC out of the box, so they get the liquidity instantly into their protocol without any like extra trust assumptions. That within one transaction, they can have access to all of the liquidity, not only in Dimension, in the whole IBC ecosystem. So I think that's pretty incredible, as well as that you have like significantly less overhead, but still the same access to capital. So once you have this relayer running
Right.
and the sequencer running on the testnet, the next step would be first for Dimension Hub to launch as a mainnet, and then you would be able to deploy your own rollup instance. It would be the same procedure. So you would go deploy, create a rollup namespace on the Dimension Hub. So it's just a message that you pass, and then once it accepts that public key from the execution client, then you can submit state updates. You have like a formalized on-chain blockchain running, and then you can connect to IBC, and that's the whole process. It's in terms of comparing it to starting a sovereign chain right now, it's less mental overhead. It's less economic overhead. It's less developmental overhead. Less developmental overhead. So in terms of core development tasks, it's very similar to building the application logic on the Cosmos chain. But in terms of like bootstrapping and like organizing validator efforts, um, economic, right? I truly believe one of the issues in blockchain is that there's too many tokens. So, and one of the core philosophies or core things that Arbitrum did very well is that they reused a token. They reused ETH as a currency, and they just take like a profit, like a regular business. So, in my opinion, rollups could actually become more like regular businesses in the sense like I'm an application deployer. I'm not an economist. I want to charge $1 per transaction, for example, and I know that the base layers,
XYZ transaction. Yeah.
yeah, the base layers are costing me 10 cents per transaction. I could start actually formalizing, hey, if I have 1,000 users or 10,000 users, and maybe 10% are submitting transactions, I could start like creating actual cash flow and understanding like that this is a business. This is something much more realistic, but still tied with the trust minimization of blockchain and the interconnectivity of IBC.
Right. I want to go back to what you said in the beginning, where there was the software stack involved, or the operation of the software stack involved publishing to Celestia, and then data routes to Dimension Hub. How much work do I have to do that? Is that part of the default stack if I just create like this basic, if I clone this basic roll app and say I would like EVM or I like the WASM on top? If I just deploy that, is that going to be a working roll app, which is publishes data to Celestia, let's say on the testnet?
Yeah. So
Or is there something I have to add?
the Celestia Light client is separate. So, but this is like a DevOps thing that could be packaged into like one process. That's not a problem. So you could choose. We just haven't implemented it yet, but you could definitely, and we'll probably do this, is that you can choose the DA layer. So the DA layer, actually, since you bring it up, I'll explain a little bit, is that Celestia and Dimension have a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences as well. So the core philosophy of Celestia is to provide DA, or data availability, and the core philosophy of Dimension Hub is to provide the settlement. Now, as a protocol, uh, DA is agnostic. So um, Dimension Hub approves which DA references that it accepts. So, for example, the governance would approve that data on chain from Celestia is accepted as a reference to Dimension Hub. The same thing can be said for data on chain for osmosis or data on chain for Evmos, is that the connection is done via IBC. Like any proof of inclusion is done with IBC. So that as a network, Celestia is the most scalable DA layer because of its data availability scheme, but it's not necessarily the only DA layer. So all L1s can be a DA layer, and what makes Cosmos very nice, especially the dimension philosophy, is that with IBC, you're connecting all of the DA layers together because you have a like client and client headers of other chains. So, for example, as a process,
So when you say governance,
yeah,
let me add a quick question here. When you say governance decides, is that Dimension Hub governance, or I, as a rollup developer, can decide I'd like my data to be on Osmosis, and could you please, can when my execution client reference data on Osmosis in processing transactions? Is that possible, or does Dimension Hub decide what are valid references?
yeah. So the Dimension Hub as a protocol decides what are valid data L1s that you can publish because they want to make sure that the community wants to make sure that it's reasonable in terms of like safety guarantees. But so the rollup chooses, the rollup deployer chooses which DA layer they want. So Celestia, for example, or Evmos, but like probably Celestia, because for them, the one of the most important criteria is that it is cost effective because they're actually paying for all the bytes that they're putting on chain. So as a rollup deployer, you get to choose which DA, but that DA has to be within the realm of the Dimension Hub's protocol. So there are a few rules that the Dimension Hub protocol submits. It's like
Right.
DA XYZ are acceptable. Blocks within XYZ have to be published before like a slashing event, for example.
Right, right. I mean, in the best of possible worlds, I don't even want to think about the DA layer, right? I want to be coding my business logic and worrying about how I'm going to provide service to my users, and I don't really want to be worrying about choosing these things. But I was curious to understand I mean, Dimension Hub obviously offers a lot of services and simplifications. Like when you describe the deployment, this is obviously something that's much faster than bootstrapping and going in there talking to people, like starting up a test net. Like I don't have to worry about any of that, right? So it makes sense for this to be out of the box. But I'm always asking myself, so where's the other part of this? Like where's the what am I paying for it? What am I somehow losing compared to, let's say, full sovereignty? And one is I can't arbitrarily decide where to store the data. Dimension Hub vets some providers, and then I can choose among the providers, right? Would that be a fair way to characterize where you guys are going with this?
Yeah, well, in terms of sovereign, they just they host the data themselves because all of the full nodes host the data themselves. But for the sequencers, they're much lighter. That they're consensus free, so anyone people have to be able to verify that it's actually like producing valid blocks. So the data has to be on chain in a BFT secure system. But that doesn't necessarily mean like for sovereign chains, they just host it, everything packaged in one thing. And when you're hosting everything packaged in one thing, when you have like the data on chain, when you have on your own chain, when you have the settlement, execution, consensus, everything, then it becomes like a huge network. And if we're talking about scaling to millions of blockchains, then we're not going to get there with sovereign chains. It's just too much overhead
Right.
for people like myself that just wants to deploy an application on AWS or whatever, but still have the trust minimization and security and the liquidity access to liquidity that rollups provide and the low latency. So sovereign blockchains, in our view, or at least in my view, is that they provide incredible sources of data availability. And Celestia as a protocol scales this pretty much with data availability sampling. But for the Dimension Hub is that all the L1s, in essence, if they accept the data because the L1 also has to have like a module that accepts arbitrary bytes as data. For example, now Bitcoin is doing that, or Bitcoin was doing that. It's just like people are realizing it now. But the data availability just has to be hosted on the blockchain. But that doesn't mean that like a particular data availability source or L1 has to be chosen. So it's more similar. It's become, in my opinion, it's going to become more similar to like Web 2 architecture, where you choose the database, and then you have the backend, which is the settlement layer of Dimension Hub. Then you have the front end, which are the execution clients or the rollups themselves. So all the users, they're going to the front end. They're going the quote unquote front end at least, which is the rollup. They are a blockchain, but they don't see the Dimension Hub, and they definitely don't interact with the database. I mean, I can't imagine interacting with the database, like knowing which database I use for like the Chase application on my banking, for example. But for blockchains, you get the security of the data from being on the L1 and L1, and then all the interconnectedness with IBC. So I think that's one of the coolest things about Dimension is that it uses existing tech, but it goes over and beyond and kind of looks at things not in a horizontal landscape where there's just an interconnected network of sovereign blockchains, but a vertical landscape as well, where we believe that it's much easier to deploy. And this is kind of like the idea of rollups on Ethereum scale one network with one ecosystem, and for Dimension rollups scale the whole network of blockchains.
Right. Let's return to this second thing you were talking about, which is sort of fast block times, or the ability for rollups to commit state updates pretty often.
Yeah.
Can you explain how as far as I understand, Dymension is an optimistic rollup system currently, which relies on fraud proofs, right? As you were saying. So, I as a user, if I think of this similar to say optimism or something like that, as a user, I get a very fast sort of interaction from the system because the optimistic rollup can commit often, right? But there is a period where I have to wait whether somebody surfaces a fraud proof. So I'd like to understand more as a user or even as a developer, right, of this project. When is the transaction considered actually settled? When can I rely on this? And does that affect how you use IBC with other chains? So if I want to commit something and then send out an async query over IBC, hey, can you do something over here? I locked my tokens, and this gets rolled back when a fraud proof is found. How would this work? Because I think that's a pretty intriguing sort of detail.
Yeah, so Dimension Hub is a settlement layer. I wouldn't call it a settlement layer only for optimistic rollups. You can have validity rollups as well, as long as there's you can actually verify the proof. The and there's also like design things that we are actually using ZK for a few things, but not everything, because like the tech isn't there yet, but it's going there. So like we just want to be sure that it's going to be flexible. But in terms of like the design for latency, is that it's actually the reason why you have low latency is because the execution client of Diamond, the replacement for Tendermint, it batches the blocks together. So it lives in like this sphere of unconfirmed transactions of say like 500 batches, 1,000 batches, 1,500 batches, and each block is produced at say 0.2 seconds configuration. So from the user experience, you're getting this very low latency. Now the transaction's not fully settled yet, but you're getting like the user experience and like everything's flowing, and pretty much in an optimistic setting, as long as if you're batching transactions, then you're getting this like soft guarantee pretty much, is that the sequencer sees your transaction, they accepted your transaction, the transaction is valid according to the state machine, but it hasn't published it on a business like a BFT chain L1 where the data can now be confirmed by anyone in the network. So in this sphere is that like before when they're batching the transactions, all of the users are experiencing very low latency. And this would be the same. This is irregardless of optimistic rollups or any other types of proofs. Is that the because it's batched, there's no like finality there. And what happens then is that the for optimistic rollups, they're not submitting a proof of validity with the batch. They're just submitting the batch data itself. So the transactions are technically settled in Dymension is that after it's accepted by the DA, and then confirmation is sent from the DA to the execution client of Diamond, and with that, it's sent to the state to update the state to the settlement layer of Dymension Hub. So you have the DA reference and you have the state roots. So it's not necessarily why the block time is slow. The block time is fast is because of optimistic rollups. It's because they batch the transactions in this kind of sphere of confirmation, and then they publish the data on chain and the state roots on chain to get this hard confirmation. Now, in terms of optimistic rollups and validity rollups, the difference would be actually the bridging time. Is that for optimistic rollups, you can it's debatable on like what is the appropriate time for bridging out of an optimistic rollup. So, for example, you want to give enough time that someone will be able to submit a fraud proof, or you want to give enough time that someone is like watching the chain. So for optimistic rollups design, so you have a delay period that's configurable. You can have also fast withdrawals in optimistic rollups running on IBC. One of the things that the team has made is that they have fast withdrawals on IBC. So you have like a relayer confirming that they're willing to accept the risk of a rollback. So it's like they become like the inherent watcher of the optimistic roll or the rollup. For example, IBC interchain accounts, I think you mentioned, like the transactions going from IBC to IBC, it's immediate to go from the hub, the Dymension hub, to the rollup because you're relying on the validity of the signatures of the validators. And the other way is that there's like a dispute period where it's like the transaction's not accepted fully by the state machine of the Dymension hub, so you can't bridge out technically on like the transfer channel before this dispute period. Now you could do it with IBC fast withdrawal, but this is like there's like two mechanisms to get out in terms of withdrawal. So if you have like interchain accounts on the Dymension hub and you're trying to like do something on a few rollups, you could send the interchain account from Dymension hub to a rollup immediately because you don't have this latency or this like potential rollback risks. Now, for validity proofs, it would just be instant once the proof is verified on the Dymension hub. So, and this is just a matter of time instead of like not if but when. And we're watching the tech closely, and we're implementing some stuff of the ZK that isn't for state machine validity, but is still very useful in terms of the architecture.
Right. How do you guys make sure if somebody's watching the chain, or like, one of the things that I was asked myself, like, is there anyone actually looking at the transactions submitting the fraud proofs? So as far as I understand, the system should incentivize people to submit fraud proofs if they do see a problem, right? Because in that case, that's one of the ways to secure the chain. How are you guys doing that? Is there like, can I also be a new participant in the system who is like somebody who looks for fraud and has a business certain like trying to find and submit fraud proofs? Is that a viable thing to be doing?
I think what makes it viable is not necessarily to assume that it's a viable business to look for fraud proofs, because that probably isn't a viable business. It's just hoping someone is doing invalid state transitions, and I don't think that's a fair assumption, especially when like a rollup network has like a single sequencer and that's their whole business, I think the fair assumption is that they're providing no invalid state transitions. But what we do to incentivize invalid watchers or verifiers is two things. One is that, and they're coupled pretty much, is the IBC fast withdrawal. So if you have a dispute period and say users want to withdraw their assets, which is a very common thing in IBC, is like to transfer from chain to chain, is that they're not going to wait, I don't know, 5 days, 7 days, whatever it may be, as decided by the research, but they want to do it within 1 minute. And this is similar to what Optimism have and Arbitrum has, is that there's a fast withdrawal mechanism where incentivized market makers pretty much are likely to watch the chain. Now, you're not guaranteed that they're watching the chain, but they're taking the risks of any rollbacks. So, for example, you submit a transaction, a user from a rollup submits a transaction on the Dymension hub and says, hey, I want to withdraw 10 dime to the Dymension hub, and I'm paying a 1 dime fee. So if anyone could upfront the costs, but the people who are going to be the safest is the people who upfront the cost and then are also verifying the validity of the chain of the rollup. So there.
Yeah, that makes absolutely sense. So you're changing the model around, and you're saying instead of incentivizing somebody to actually look for problems on the chain, you're saying there will be services provided to users which are actually added value for them. Like I can do this thing for you quickly.
So it's both.
And within that service, it's in the best interest of the provider to actually be part of the chain verification, but be part of verifying whether those funds are actually there.
Yeah. So it's that plus the sequencer actually staking Dime. So if there's a fraud proof that is caught, that sequencer stake is slashed and given in portion to the fraud prover. So you're getting the assumption that they're going to verify based on the fees from the fast withdrawal plus the additional staking amount that they need to implement.
Right. No, I like this. I really like this. It's still swirling through my head. So I could design another service that does something for the users of the roll apps that's providing something like these fast withdrawals, and I'd be also incentivized to watch the chains maybe from a different perspective, to safely provide my service, right, while I'm extracting a fee, because that service actually has added value for the user. I like that construction.
Yeah. So there's in my opinion, like most of the innovation is going to happen on the execution layer on the roll apps. So Dymension Hub has to be just like create enough to allow the flourishment of innovation in terms of like infrastructure, in terms of application logic. There's a lot of experimentation, I believe, that will be done on Dymension, and that's just because it's much easier and like you start playing around with things. And yeah, I'm super excited to see like what other people come up with that can be layered on top of the core infrastructure of what like Dymension is.
When I was looking at the docs, trying to understand these various pieces, I noticed something about shared liquidity or something about also a DEX service that the hub provides. So, I mean, my general question is, I get this SDK to develop a rollup. And I get the settlement service, and there's pre-built, let's say, plugins to use Celestia as my DA. Do I get any other services like this DEX that are somehow advantages for me as a developer of a blockchain?
Yeah, so for us, we're very product oriented in the sense that we want to make the developer's experience very seamless, or as seamless as possible in our vision. And one of the services that need to be provided is if you have your own token, then you want to have access to pricing for that token. You want to have a stable pricing as well. You don't want to put a liquidity pool on AMMX, AMMY, AMMZ. You just want to have one core liquidity pool that prices your token relative to a stable asset, and you have like concentrated liquidity there, so the price isn't too volatile. And this is like because we expect and we hope that there's millions of rollups. And when there's millions of rollups, there's a lot of like long tail assets with not a lot of liquidity. So we want to make sure that all of the liquidity is kind of concentrated in one place. And for a developer, once you're deploying a rollup with a create a rollup transaction on the Dymension Hub, like creating that namespace, we also want you to create a liquidity pool because liquidity in blockchain, when you're creating your own token, is core infrastructure. It's core to the user experience. It's core to your
Absolutely.
system. So you want to price your token if you have a token, of course, because Dimension provides that flexibility to have access to the liquidity pool. On top of that, down the line, as people are developing the IBC stack as well, you can have broadcasting, for example, that the Dimension Hub broadcasts the Oracle prices for specific pools that you're subscribed to. So now you can have like on every block new Oracle spinning from the Dimension Hub, which is concentrated liquidity, to your individual rollup. Um, so there's a lot of cool constructions, but at the core of it is that we're product oriented and we want the best product for a developer, and the developer needs, if they have their own token, they need to price their own token, and they want to price their own token not on like 15 exchanges, but on one that provides the best pricing, and that would be most, in generally, the ones that have the most concentrated liquidity for that asset. And now the AMM is gonna start in a very simple, uh, like a Uniswap version 2, where the liquidity is like distributed across the space. But we'll play around with constructions. We're more focused on providing the liquidity pools right now rather than optimizing them. But optimizing could also happen down the line.
So the general idea, the way I can think of this is there will be sort of like a pairwise AMM between DYM and whatever token there is, and that I can hop through DYM and exchange like any pairs I want.
What do you
Is
mean?
that sort of like a fair mental model, or is it like
No,
no? By this I mean is let's say you've got 5 rollups, right? And for our purposes, they all have their own tokens. Is my mental model of this shared liquidity pool correct in the sense that I can take my token, swap it for a token of another roll app, and just have go and do something on their roll app? Are you guys expecting this sort of interactivity between those roll apps?
well, in the simplest case, it's kind of just like osmosis pools on a dimension chain. So you have IBC pools, and in like the core code of it, it says like dime IBC XYZ, dime IBC XY X, whatever. So the liquidity pools, in terms of like shared liquidity, they're just uh, pooling their assets into one in a few pools, so it creates stabler pricing assets. But you can start constructing different ideas with IBC and liquidity pools. I think you could start playing around with kind of like each liquidity pool is split into like for different rollups to use, like the dam from Starkware. But these are more complex uh, designs that may not necessarily provide great benefits, or I'm not exactly sure if the more complex AMM is better. So we would definitely have to like think about it carefully of like what provides the best pricing for all of the rollups individually, and what provides the best user experience for providing liquidity, for swapping liquidity, and for things like that. But from a mental model, it's kind of just osmosis, but easy access. So they have this already
Okay.
connection to the Dimension Hub. They're already interacting with it to create the rollup. They're already interacting with to submit state updates. This is already kind of like a part of the core package of what Dimension provides in the RDK. Pretty much is that you get to choose your database. You get to build your liquidity pool. You get to have IBC out of the box. So there's just core things that we couple together that in the Cosmos ecosystem it exists like one or another, but they're usually fragmented. And for us, it's when we're creating a vertical stack, it's much more beneficial to create like this kind of vertical integration of services, and then the rollups themselves could kind of experiment with other things.
Right. Right. Got it. So if I take a step back, we've been in the weeds around here discussing different aspects. If we take a step back into Cosmos, in a few years, there's a lot of competition for how blockchains should operate, right? We've discussed extensively a comparison to sovereign blockchains. There are also projects like Saga. There's ICS. There are consumer chains running on ICS. There's mesh security. There's the Terra Alliance. All these models that aim to make it easier to sort of bootstrap your chain. Where do you see the place of Dymension in this ecosystem?
I believe
What's your take on the
yeah,
future?
this is definitely just my take, but I believe that there's going to be kind of a formalization between interchain security and mesh security, where they're going to go closer to the route of mesh security, uh, and step away from replicated security from like a interchain security V1 perspective, just because you don't want like validators just running a bunch of binaries and like how like decentralized is that or how scalable is that? I don't think that's going to be there in the future. But like I really love the teams and they're really smart people. It's just like an MVP product. That's what I see interchain security V1 as. The way I see it in the future is a mesh of L1 security. So Osmosis sharing kind of staked with Dimension Hub, Dimension Hub sharing stake with uh, Cosmos Hub, for example. And this is kind of more of coordination security rather than economic, because you're just like sharing stake rather than like increasing the amount of stake required to attack the chain. So on the L1 layer, I see a bunch of kind of application logic, app specific chains, but also them becoming DA chains. So every L1, I believe, will become a DA chain, or almost everyone, because it's just filling up your block space. You might as well try to convince rollups to post transactions on your block space to increase the demand for your token. So on the L1 layer, I see a lot of mesh security chains kind of interacting with each other, maybe 50, 60, 100. I'm not sure if there is a limit to the expansion of L1 chains in terms of DA, but I think it's going to grow much slower than the L2 expansion because it's much easier to deploy rollups. So from my perspective, I see just I don't know, a bunch of DA or app specific L1 sovereign chains that host the rollups. So the rollups, the IBC transactions go through Dimension Hub, the settlement goes through the Dimension Hub. The Dimension Hub is sharing security with the other L1 chains, but the rollups choose the DA chain and the settlement hub as the Dimension chain. So from my perspective, it's kind of like a web of shared security rather than an individual product winning out. I don't think, I think Dimension Hub is good with mesh security. I think it benefits from mesh security. So I don't see it as a competitive product. I think Cosmos Hub is good with
That's interesting too.
maybe five chains on interchain security, five specific ones like Stride, for example, providing liquidity, staking derivatives, Noble providing generic asset issuance. These are like core things that should be immediately secure from day one. But I don't see it necessarily needing to go to 50 chains or 100 chains. I think it hurts both the validators, the Cosmos Hub, and probably the consumer chains because it's not that much easier to deploy with interchain security. Um, and then, yeah, so that's how I see it. I see it as a web of security. And that's probably how Cosmos as an ecosystem or dimension or whatever you want to call it, or this IBC enabled ecosystem competes with the Ethereums of the world, where they have pretty cool architectures already, and Polkadots of the world, who people may or may not like them in terms of like the user experience, but they have good tech as well. But that's how I see the future of Cosmos is that a mesh of L1s with uh, like a greater expansion of L2s using those L1s as kind of like the blockchain security.
That's a pretty compelling vision. Let me close with one more question. Is there a project or a type of blockchain where you'd say, Dimension Hub is not a good place for this thing? Like that's not a good match. Is there any reason for me not to build on a Dimension Hub, where you yourself would go, oh, I don't think this is a good match for us? Or do you feel that it's really general purpose in the sense of there are really no use cases that don't have a place in Dimension Hub?
If you're building with the UTXO model, I'm not exactly sure how compatible ABCI is with UTXO, but that's very specific use case in terms of fuel. Even though you can
Yeah, I don't
simulate
think anybody's going to do that now.
you can simulate fuel mint. There's a project called Fuel Mint that simulates the UTXO on ABCI, so I'm not maybe that's not even a problem. But in general, rollups are they're pretty agnostic to what you can build. So as is a Cosmos sovereign chain, you can build a game, you can build an NFT project, and something that's actually something that we haven't got into is that I think I'm actually wearing an NFT hat, which is Utes from Solana, and I believe NFTs are going to be one of those things in rollups that people actually don't see coming, is because NFTs in rollups are used for governance, or they can be used for governance. So replacing validators that control both the consensus and governance. On rollups, you can have NFTs that you lock up for governance. You could have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and that's how you can further decentralize a rollup in terms of governance. So I think there's a lot of use cases. I truly believe that NFT projects will become rollups, and the NFT projects will have applications within them because that's kind of like their community. So, for example, if I gave like what I envision as the first use case or one of the first use cases for rollups is that you have a Pudgy Penguins or NFT or Utes project that becomes their own rollup, which means that the NFT community governs and controls their blockchain. That also means that they get a portion of the rewards. So you get automatic value accrual to the NFTs based on the usage of the rollup or the blockchain. And with CosmWasm, for example, you can submit a thing where only permission smart contracts are deployed on the rollup. So now the NFT community or the governors have to decide, like, do we allow this smart contract application to be deployed on our ecosystem? Does this fit our identity as a group? Maybe I don't want to allow a game, or maybe I don't want to allow something else. Maybe like our NFT or rollup is DeFi specific, so we allow only DeFi specific smart contract deployers. So you could create this ecosystem of rollups, and I think NFTs, something that people don't talk about a lot, are kind of core to like the user experience of rollups, and it's something that we haven't actually shared. But there's a lot of things that we haven't actually shared. But in terms of the the user experience and developing and creating of what is a rollup ecosystem, what is a blockchain, I think it's the first time that NFTs become their own blockchain, that NFT communities actually become their own community. I think that's one of the coolest things that we've been working on more recently. And so in terms of like fit, you can say that a product market fit could be rollups, could be NFTs, or it could be games, because I was talking to someone where they were on one of the Ethereum projects, had higher cost on the L2s than the L1s. And for a Dymension, that's not going to happen because you can post the data wherever you like, as long as it kind of fits the vetting of the Dymension hub. So, like, especially with Celestia, using data availability sampling, we really don't see data cost being an issue. So now you have on-chain games, you have NFTs, DeFi, like you're automatically tied to the IBC world. So you immediately have access to all of the liquidity flowing around IBC, and it's not siloed by any chains. So if you need to raise capital for deploying a DEX or whatever, for perps like GMX, this is a great use case. But honestly, I hope the use cases expand. I hope that Dimension rollup architecture, like the accessibility of rollups as a accessibility to blockchain from regular applications. I hope that's what rollups also allow. So like you don't need to deploy your own token. Maybe we have more regular applications or regular companies becoming or tying their stack closer to what is a blockchain to maybe have access to whatever part of the stack that they benefit from. Is that like instant settlements, like verifiability? Is it liquidity? Is it other forms of derivatives from security? But in terms of product market fit, it's very general. I mean, there's approach that the Dimension team is taking in terms of growing the ecosystem, but as an end product, it's a general product for anyone to deploy their application.
You guys have a lot of stuff in store for us. So I'm really happy you took out the time to come and talk to us on bare metal.
Thank you.
And I appreciate all the info about Dimension Hub, and wish you guys the best luck moving forward.
Appreciate it. It's a lot of info, but there's a lot of things going on in the ecosystem. What can I say?
Okay, thanks very much for coming on, Barry. It was a great session.
Appreciate it. Thank you.